Hey everyone. I'm going to make a quick video going through the basics of table making in Word. Hopefully this is helpful to you all and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Also, apologies, I'm a little congested today, so if you hear, if I cough or sneeze or anything, that's why. Okay, so I made up this very basic question using the CARS dataset and SATs, which I think has been used in some of the data tutorials so far. Um, and basically what we're asked is to create a single table summarizing the descriptive statistics. So each of these variables, and we'll think about mean, median, frequency, and or frequency percent, so on, for each vehicle type. So when we think about for each vehicle type, what that could mean is, maybe some less advanced statisticians might think, okay, that's four different tables. But when we make a table one, we can include all of these different categories in the columns of our table. So we're almost treating it like an exposure group. So if we were to run an observational trial or a randomized control trial where we have different exposures, those are what's going to take up the columns, right? So we would have a control group followed by exposure group or multiple exposure groups. In a randomized trial, we're trying to look at kind of the balance between groups. Observational, we might look at the balance, test. Later on, we're going to control for things and actually test whether the exposure changed anything. So we want to present what those confounders are. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to this Insert tab at the top. I'm going to click on Table, and I want to think about how many columns I want and about how many rows I want. I'm going to add rows as I go, but for the columns at the beginning, I find it helpful to really think about what the makeup is going to be, because it'll help out later on. So one thing that we always include in a table one is a column that includes all of the variables, right? So every table one in general, is going to have at least two columns, one for my variables and then one for those descriptive statistics. In this case, we have four different groups, four different kind of exposure groups. So what I'm going to start out adding is that one column for my variables and then four columns for each of those groups. I'm going to drag down all the way to 8 and we'll just add rows as we go along. What you can also do and what's easy is just go insert table here and you can manually update the number of columns and number of rows. I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to add columns as we go. Okay, so the first thing I do is update my columns. So I know I'm going to have variables here. I'm going to work on formatting later. Then I'm going to have each of my groups. In this case, there's no order to them. So it doesn't really matter what order I put them in. I'm going to do alphabetical order because that's how SAS is going to present them. But if there is an order, you probably want to follow that. So that would be like a control group first, followed by the exposure groups. And if it's kind of a dose response, so you have different levels of the exposure, you'll want to start out with the lowest and then go up to the highest. Okay, so if I'm doing alphabetical, hopefully I get this right. So do minivan, pickup, and what I'm doing here is I'm just pressing tab and it'll take you to the next cell. Sports car and SUV. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my variable column, and this is just how I do it. You can do it whatever way you want, but I'm going to fill out this shell of the table first before I actually input any data. And I'm going to add in what my variables are. So I have them all up here. Again, order doesn't matter too much. There are some conventions that people will follow sometimes. So demographics might be presented first. So things like first, age and then followed by sex and race. But again, like in this case, there's no real order to how I should present these. So I'm just going to add them all in the order they're presented here. So I'm going to start out with color. And when I think about color, what do I know about it? Well, I know it's categorical. It's not numbers, so this is pretty straightforward. And it's also nominal because there's no actual order to colors. So what I can do is I don't have to follow any specific order to it. But I put them all in under color. So basically these are different levels or kind of groups within color. So I list color out first. This will all be kind of an empty row here. I'm just telling the reader, hey, this is my main variable. What's underneath here are all the levels. Again, no order, right? So I can just do this in alphabetical order. So that's just going to be black, blue, red. Nope, grays. See, already QRST, gray, red, and white. See, there's too many. I included too many colors. If you are interested in my code, what I basically did was I had it randomly assigned colors, and then different probabilities of colors per car type. So none of this is actually real, but I probably did add too many colors. Okay. So that's my variable color. What you're going to want to do when you have a variable like this with different levels is we want to tell readers while they're looking through it, basically, like, we have nothing for this main color. It's just telling us what the levels are. And these are all the levels. So what I do is I add an indent here, and that's pretty common. So the way to do that is, again, you can right click. I just go to the layout tab, and then I can just add an indent on the left. So we'll do 2. So now we're out of rows. So what do? Well, we want to add another row. There are a couple ways of doing this. What I normally get into the habit of doing, which maybe isn't the best because it's better to add multiple rows at once if you know that you're going to have a ton, is if you just go to the last cell here. So I'm in the SUV column and I'm the last, and you click tab, it'll just add a new row. So then you can just keep going. What you can also do is go in that table layout tab at the top, and you can click insert below, and it'll insert a full entire row below. So when I'm building a table shell, I'm almost entirely working within this table layout tab. So that's really helpful when you are actually like filling out everything in the table. Once I get to the formatting and I want to make it like a pretty table that's appropriate for an academic journal, that's when I'm going to go to this table design tab at the top. Okay, so we're done with the color variable. Again, there's an indent. When you have an indent, you can just click backspace and it'll get rid of it in the table. The next variable is driver satisfaction. Again, this is categorical and it's binary. We've talked about whether this is nominal or ordinal. For this, I really just like to say this is just a binary variable. So because it's binary, we could do the same thing here where we have color and then we have 2 different levels to it. However, when we know what the value is of one of those levels, we know the other, right? Because it's just the total minus that, or if it's a percent, then it's 100 minus that percent. Don't have to include kind of those levels there. You can just have one row that takes up driver satisfaction. I just need to clarify which one I'm talking about. So I'm going to say driver satisfied. So that tells me that it's the affirmative that I'm presenting. Next up, we have all-wheel drive, yes or no. Again, it's binary, right? And so we can just have one row take it up. So we say all-wheel drive, again, signaling that this is the affirmative position. So we're going to do the percent of yes. And now we get into our numerical variables. So the first one is retail price. Retail price we know is a numerical variable, and it's also going to be continuous because it's dollars. Sometimes they present ranges of dollars. This one is continuous. So that tells us that we can use the mean and standard deviation. We don't have to include the median. So when I add this, I'm just going to say retail price. And yeah, I think we'll just add the means and stuff later on. I'm just going to add these for now. So engine size, and then also clarify the units here. So retail prices in dollars. I don't have to do that for the categorical variables because they're just percentages. And I'll get into that in a little bit when we continue to update these columns and rows. Then number of cylinders, no units there, it's just a count. Okay, so back when we talked about what types of numerical and categorical variables these are, that's when it gets important into how we're going to signal to the reader or signal to whoever's looking at our table what kind of statistics we're presenting, right? So for categorical data, it doesn't matter if it's ordinal or if it's nominal. It's always just going to be basic n and percent, so frequency and percent. So for color, right next to color, I'm going to add an n and a percent in parentheses. So now I'll know that each of these levels are being presented as an n and a percent. Driver satisfied, again, n in percent, just the frequency of it, right? We just need to know what the frequency is and what the percent is. all-wheel drive, N%, retail price, because it's continuous, we can do a mean and a standard deviation. Engine size, I'm going to skip for now, and then number of cylinders, we know that is discrete, so we're going to have to use the median. Okay. And the median is presented with the interquartile range. That's important to remember. I've seen some people do the minimum and maximum, which, I think minimum and maximum can be helpful sometimes, but what we really want to present with the median is the interquartile range. So now for engine size, this is a continuous variable. However, I just want to add that if you are ever unsure about whether something is continuous or discrete, or if you think, hey, maybe this actually isn't normal, and you can run some tests to that. We'll get into that a little bit later in the class. What you're going to want to do is present both the mean and the median. And this is not something you'll see in academic journals as much, but for this class, I will say, like, if you present both the mean and the median, one that can be like helpful when you're writing up something. It can tell you a little bit about the distribution, right? Well, if they're really different, maybe there's a high skew. But also, when I'm grading things, I'm going to take off points if you forget to include the median and it's not a continuous variable. But I won't take points off if you include both the mean and the median. So keep that in mind. So let's say we want to present both here. How do we format that? So again, what I can do is go to that table layout tab, insert a row below, and I'll do 2. I highlighted it. You don't have to highlight it, but I don't know. It helps me keep track of where I am in the table. And kind of like the way we presented these levels here, what I can do is have one kind of row that's presented as the mean and standard deviation, and one that's the median and IQR. And again, I'm going to add an indent. It's layout, indent 2. Another thing that we want to present in table 1s is the total sample distribution. So I don't include it here in this question. I just say summarize each of these. And I think if this is the question that you're asked, it's okay to exclude it. But if you're really making a real table, in addition to the exposure groups, we have to include what the distribution is like in the overall sample, those descriptive statistics for the overall sample, because it really just tells us what everything looks like. Especially like in your write-up, you want to talk about what everything looks like and not just by group. Okay, so now we want to add a total column. So how we do this is we just go back to that table layout. We say insert column left. Again, you can right click here. And you'll notice this table is a little messy. Okay, so we have, 4 different levels of our exposure. We have an additional total column. We have a lot of variables. I mean, it's not an exorbitant amount, but this table is just going to get messy. We already see things taking up multiple lines. So this depends on the journal and the formatting requirements and so on. But what I'll do when I have a table like this that's just kind of everything smushed together is I will change the layout of the page. So I'm going to briefly go over how to do that. So if we put this on a new page, you can do enter, enter, enter. You can also do insert page break. And let's title this. Good rule of thumb too is to include a table title. So I'll just say table 1, statistic of cars or types. And what I would do now is go to this layout tab and change the orientation, right? So now I can actually have it take up more space, and I'll get into changing the links of these different columns. But what that does is it changes the layout of the entire document. So now I have this weird layout here where it's landscape, and it's just messy. That's not really appropriate. So what you're actually going to want to do is rather than do a page break here, you're going to want to do a section break. How do we do that? Well, in the layout tab, you can see this breaks tab, I'm calling everything tab, but this breaks section. When you go to the bottom, you see page breaks and section breaks. You're just going to want to add a section break. I'm going to put it on the next page. So what this tells Word is basically, this is a separate section than what than what's before, and therefore I can make layout changes that are only going to apply to this section. So now when I change it to a landscape orientation, it only changes it for this slide, this page, and not the page before. And then kind of similarly, if you want to go back to the portrait size, you can just add another section break here, orientation portrait, and then it'll go right back. That's just a helpful tip. I feel like I have to look that up a lot. How do I make a single page just landscaped? So that's pretty easy. So now we want to spread it out. I wish Word did this automatically and made this fit the page, but it doesn't. So what you can do here is just highlight everything. And then when we go to our table design, when we right click it, we can do, I always mess up how to do this, table properties, table layout. Oh yeah, it is table layout, sorry everyone. For the width, we can just update it to something. So right now it's 1.05. Let's see what it looks like at 1.3. That looks pretty good. 1.5, that works. We'll do 1.5 and then everything should be good. I might make this variable column bigger and then actually make these smaller. What I don't like things being on multiple rows, taking up kind of two lines, but this is fine. Set these, and it's generally good practice to have kind of like each of your different columns be the same. So 1 point looks good to me. Okay. So this is called, or I call this a table shell. The only other thing that you're going to want to make sure you add, but that is dependent on the data, is the overall ends for your different groups. And this is something people leave out on assignments a lot. So it's just important to remember as you're going through, like we need to know what the sample size is for each of these groups when we think about comparing the groups, because that's a really important thing, right? If one group has a sample size of 5 and the other has a sample size of 2,000, that's a really big difference, and that's important to know. The way that we list this is I'm just going to say total in parentheses n equals, and then I'll put that value. So now, kind of where we actually have to look at our data and start putting things in. So I'm going to go to SAS. This is on SAS ODA. Again, this is the CARS data set. I have everything written out. So I have things for numerical and categorical data. Just going to run everything. Excuse me. Okay, so I ran the freq procedure, proc freq. And this first table is just telling me the overall distribution of everything. So I know that for minivan, it's 40, n equals 40. For pickup, it's going to be n equals 48. For sports car, n equals 120. And for SUV, n equals 98. And then for the total, it's just all of those added together. So we can go to the cumulative frequency, and it'll be the last one there, so 306. Okay, again, I don't like it taking up multiple lines, so when I go to these columns, I'm just going to make the width 1.35, 1.4, 1. Okay, we can update this later. This is not great, but whatever. You can also drag it around, which is helpful in Word. Whatever, I'll just keep it on separate lines. Okay, one more thing I'm going to get into just before we add in values officially is just some basic formatting stuff. To make it a really pretty table, I'll go into it at the end. But just like the basics of what are expected, normally I make the columns all bold, and I will make them centered as well. And I like to make the numbers centered as well, so I'm just going to update that. So when I put it in, they show up as that. And then for bolding for the variables, I'm going to add bold for everything except for those like different levels. So now is the kind of tedious part when you have to enter in each of the different ends and percents and means and medians, so on. So one way you can do this, which is I know really annoying, is you can just do it by hand. So I have all my tables pulled up. If we first want to do the mean for the retail price, so we can just copy this mean, put it right. So this is for the minivan and its retail price. So we just paste that in, paste in the standard deviation, and we already have kind of the format of how that should be here, the mean, and then in parentheses standard deviation. which is kind of annoying, but that's the way you can do it. Um, if you want to merge a cell, so one thing that you might see sometimes is, let's see, if we add a row above here, what some people do is kind of with these levels, we'll say, we'll add a header to be like, hey, this is a car type. So what you'd want to do here is you'd want to merge these cells together. Then we can just type in car types, and that'll just tell you, hey, that's what these are. I'm not going to add it because it's pretty obvious here, but know that that's how you merge a cell, which can be helpful sometimes. Splitting it, you just click this split cell up at the top. Okay, so now I'm going to put in the data. And what I'm going to do here is walk through kind of how you can automate some of this in Excel. So I'll add a pin at the end once we get to the like real table formatting, because I know that, you can do this by hand. It doesn't really matter. There's lots of different ways to do this. But for people that actually do want to learn how to concatenate things together and make it a little bit easier in Excel, feel free to watch. So I'll go through that. Okay. So one thing I noticed with my SAS code is that I have the total for the frequency procedure, but I don't have it for my numerical variables. So what I'm going to have to do is just do my proc means and not include that class variable. Run. Oh, another thing too is like if you are sure that something is numerical, you can of course add this, change this to just have the mean and standard deviation. I included everything just in case. But that might make it a little easier to put it into your table. Again, you might want to think about including both the mean and median, just in case you miss that something's not normal. Okay, so run everything, and I'm going to work through how we can get this all into a table. So I have an empty sheet pulled up in Excel. What I can do is I can output these tables, or I can just copy and paste. I'm going to copy and paste for now, just because I know a lot of people do that. So, and it's pretty easy. So if you look at this table here from the frequency procedure, we have everything separated by blue, black, right? Actually, you know what? Let's work with numerical data first because that's a little easier because SAS actually presents them together, which it doesn't always do for the proc freq. So yeah, you can look at this and you can say like, hey, this table is horrible. Like I can't understand anything in it, right? I have these columns that are just overall mean. I have to like figure out where, if I'm looking at number of cylinders, I have to figure out where that's located. It's just a lot. So I think it is really helpful to put it into a better table. So we have everything copied into Excel from SAS. What I'm going to do is use the concatenate function, which basically puts different strings together. It's also in SAS, but I'm just using it in Excel to format everything so that I have the mean and then in parentheses the standard deviation. So I'm just going to do an equal sign, which tells Excel I'm making a function. I'm going to say concat. If you're working in Google Sheets, you're going to want to use concatenate rather than concat because concat will only let you do two strings. And in this case, we have multiple because we have some numbers that we're treating as strings and then some parentheses and spaces. We're going to start out with the mean. Then we're going to do in quotes to tell it this is what I'm adding to it, a space and a parenthesis, then my standard deviation, and finish it off with quotes around a parenthesis to tell it that's the end. So adding that parenthesis to the end of it. So now, pretty easy. It just has my mean and then in parentheses standard deviation. If we pull it down, it'll do it for everything. However, when we look at the standard deviation for engine size and number of cylinders, which one, for number of cylinders, it's not super important because we're not presenting the mean, but for engine size, there's a lot of numbers after the decimal point. So that's something you're going to want to deal with. So how do we deal with that? There is a function called text, which will basically allow you to update numbers that are becoming text to only include a certain number of numbers after that decimal point. So all it is just text, and then in parentheses, you're going to include that number, comma, in quotes, because this is now going to be a string, not number anymore, 0.00. You do 0.0, 0.000, and that'll just control how many numbers come after the decimal point. And I'm going to do the same for the standard deviation, text D4, comma, 0.00, and that. Boom. So now everything should look a lot better. There, easy. Okay, so now we move on to the median and IQR, which is exactly the same, except instead of including only one number in the parentheses, we're including two. So you could literally just copy this and bring it over two, because that's how far away median is from mean in the SAS table. And then just add in after those the upper quartile. I'm going to rewrite it just so you all can see. So again, that's just going to be equal concat, then my median, followed by a space and a parentheses, followed by the lower quartile first, then a comma and space, then the upper quartile. And maybe you can tell I've done this a lot to try to get things that are not pretty in SAS to look at least somewhat better to be pasted into a table, but that's how you do it. Voila. Okay. For the median and IQR at this point, there's not too many decimal points, which makes sense, right? Because it's like, this should be presented at least with discrete variables that don't have a ton of decimal points. So the only time it adds one is when it's an uneven number and it has to find something in between two others. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just put these in the order they present in the table to make it a little bit easier for me to copy and paste. So if I go to my table, here's the order. I have it highlighted. First, we start out with the mean and standard deviation for retail price, followed by a blank row of engine size, right? Because those levels underneath are what we're presenting. And then followed by number of cylinders, that's the median. So the first thing I'm going to start out with is I'm just going to say, okay, first I need the mean and standard deviation for MSRP. Then I'm going to have an extra space. Then I want the mean and standard deviation of engine size. Then I want the median and IQR. And what you can do too is just literally add mean SD up here and median IQR here so you remember what it is. And then you can even paste these variables over here so that you remember the order and you don't have to look all the way over. So P, engine size, the mean, and then the median, and then followed by at the very bottom, the median IQR for just number of cylinders. So then I can just go straight here, copy this, go over to my table, and paste it all in, making sure that I start with that first retail price variable. Easy. Now, when I paste in these bigger tables here that have all of the different labels, all of the different vehicle types, I can just use that exact same code to get everything in the exact order that I want it to be in. So I paste this in, and then I just take my median and mean IQRs and paste it, or again, one column away from the rest of these variables because I added this variable column in. So 1 over, paste. I just check these to make sure it's still the mean and standard deviation, and it is. So then I can just literally go here and copy and paste this here. Then for pickup, we'll do pickup. Take this out. Oops. Again, have this copied. And I'm going to leave the mean and median out just so I can line it up directly with where it starts. For pickup here, again, I'm just going to make sure everything copied correctly, and it did. Do this here. Next, I have sports car, which is actually at the bottom, so don't know what that's about. Sports car, so I'll go to the very bottom, copy, yes, paste it in. And lastly, SUV. So just go up one and copy these. And I just find this a lot easier than doing it all by hand. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to frequencies. So what I'm going to do now too is I'm just going to save this, and I'm going to call it, let's call it table making. And it's just such a good idea to like save these files that you make that are using some type of code to make tables, because you could use it for future tables with minor adjustments. So I can even call this sheet like numerical data, and then I can add another one that's called categorical data. And now I have these for any kind of future table that I'm making. So I find that pretty easy. So for doing categorical data next, we're going to do frequencies, which is a little frustrating in SAS because it presents everything separately, but we're going to still work through it. So we have the freq procedure here. So now we're working with categorical data. This table isn't as important, right? Because this is just how we got our ends. We don't actually have a column that looks at the percent of the different frequencies. So ignore that for now. We just use that for our ends. And we're going to get into these monstrosities where it includes like everything by everything. So let's actually just like look at this table first, figure out what it's saying. So when we look at our table, and I'll actually just copy this really quickly into Excel so it can be right next to our table. When we look at, and oh my gosh, look at that. That's awful. Anyways, when we look at our table, we want to figure out what kind of percent we want to be presenting. So for total, it shouldn't be too hard, right? Because this is just over everything. So there's really only 1% we can use. But for minivan, pickup, sports car, and SUV, it gets to be an issue, right? Because we can use either the column percent or the row percent. The row percent is going to be across rows. So all of these will add up to 100. And this, for example, minivan will be out of the total for rows, or column where it's out of all of these. And I'm using color as an example right here just because it has so many levels. So all of those different ends will add up to, or sorry, all of those different percentages will add up to 100. When we make table ones, I'm going to say it's a good rule of thumb to think about using column percent. The reason why is because the goal of table ones is really to compare the balance and distribution between different exposure groups. So for that reason, we can see what the makeup looks like per each category and then compare it to each other. If we did it across the rows, then the N itself is going to play a huge part, right? Because like 10 out of 40 is a lot bigger of a percentage than 10 out of 120. So when we compare it in terms of the column percent, we can actually directly look at, hey, what does the makeup look like within these groups compared to each other? So when we go back to SAS, we say frequency percent, row percent, column percent. What SAS will do is talk in terms of its own output tables, right? So when it says row percent, it means across rows like this. When it says column percent, it means across columns like this, which is not necessarily what you're doing in your table. So in our table, what we want to do, so for example, we see that there is a frequency 4, right, for blue. So for blue, we say 4, sorry, for, is this for minivan? Yes. We say 4, and then in parentheses, it will be our percent, and we want to do 4 out of 40. So 4 out of 40, 40 is over here, is actually going to be the row percent variable here, so 10. Because what it's doing is it's saying these things on the X side of the table. If you're familiar with like matrices, this is kind of the X, is my are going to be my rows, which is not how our table is set up. So that's just something that's important to keep in mind as you're looking at SAS tables, is it's not going to always stack up to what your table is presenting. So if I go back to the code, one thing that I can do to just make it easier is just, rather than do vehicle type first, I'll do it after. And that'll just make it easier on myself later on when I'm trying to put it into a table to remember that I'm using the column percent now, because these are going to be on the Y side of things up at the top. Okay, so once we do this, let's run everything again. I'm just gonna, why not? It should be presented. Yep, it's presented now as the columns are the different categories of cars. So that's just right here, and it's pretty straightforward. Now we know that it's the column percent. And I do think this makes it a little easier to paste into the graph. Okay, so let's take that out, put this in. And now we're going to use that same exact concatenate function, just instead of doing a mean, standard deviation, and median IQ car, we're going to do the frequency in parentheses, the percent. So we're going to say equal, I always do one column over. We know this first value is the frequency. We rearranged everything. Oh, I need to add concat. We know that that first value is the frequency. We know that now we want the column percent because we set it up so that the exposure group was kind of that second variable in that multiplication, or that asterisk sign. I think it's, yeah, kind of a by symbol, which is the last variable here. But we want to add in a space and then a parenthesis followed by that number, and then a parenthesis. Now, what you could do is also add in a percent sign here. So then it's 4 and 10%. You can also do the sig fig thing as well, but I don't care too much at this point, just because none of these have massive decimal numbers after the decimal. But because in our table we already specify that, hey, we're presenting the n%, it's not super important. Okay, so I have that concatenated together. Then I could just go right, so I started with black, then blue, and just copy it on the first line of every single one. Red, silver, and red is 0. So that's probably a problem with the function I made in SAS to make this variable. Okay, and also the ends are pretty small, so that's probably part of it as well. So now I have everything set up. I'm going to make sure it's following the same order. So it's black, blue, gray, red, silver, white. Perfect. And it's set up exactly like that. So now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to highlight all of this text. I'm going to click on the search and find function, or just tab up at the top of Excel. I'm going to click go to special. I'm going to click blanks. So I'm selecting all of those blank cells, and then I'm going to delete them. So I right click and I delete. Shift cells up. And now it just puts all of them smushed together because I took out all those blank cells, and it'll still have them kind of equally, it'll still have them go through exactly, what cells you put them with to begin with. So this one is down here with the white. This one is with the silver. And this is just an easy thing to do when you really want to move cells around, but you don't want to change where the formula is affecting. So now I can just directly go in and paste this into my minivan. Easy. See how easy that is? It's great. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is just go right down to this driver satisfaction one. And again, because I have this already written out, I can just very easily apply this same kind of function, but to this new output table. And in this case, I only need one, right? Because it's a binary variable. So I just go straight here. I go 1 over, I paste it in, I make sure that it's correct and it's applying to satisfied. Boom, copy that, go back over to my table, and I put that in. And I know that this is just applying to minivan, so easy. Okay, and then I can go down to the bottom, paste that in there, do the same thing. And again, this is no yes, so all-wheel drive, I want to go down to yes, paste that in, copy, and boom. Now, if you want to be really special too, you can actually just directly paste these above. So here, I just need to take out all of these blank cells and move it over one to get them all in the correct order. So yeah, let's do that. Why not? So what I can do is I'm going to copy this and just paste it up here to put them next to each other because it's kind of hard to move cells from one column to another. But again, you can try to do the delete thing too, which is really handy. Okay, so now everything's set up. You just want to make sure sometimes that everything went accordingly. So I go down here and I say, oh, yep, that's exactly the right thing I want to do. And we did it for minivan. Now, what's great about Excel is I can just copy this and paste it right next to it, and it'll do it for the pickup truck. Another thing to keep in mind here is that these are shifted over one just because of copy and paste error. So that might make things a little easier. So yeah, let's add this over here. There. So now it's all set up in the order that we want it in. And I just copy and paste everything. And again, I'll check and make sure that it's like going correctly. It's almost like Excel's almost like seeing behind the hood of what code is doing in R or SAS or Python, where it's running through these different loops of things. But in Excel, I am managing the loops. So when I pull that cell down, it's doing it for every single line, and I can see, okay, this is actually what's doing. So you have a bit more control, which is nice, but it is a little bit more tedious. So I check and make sure, yep, that's my N and percent that I want to use for sports car. Then I do it for blue, and that's all correct. I go to the last cell, and this one, E55, it's all the way down here. Perfect. and everything's set up. So pick up, I can copy and paste right in here. I don't know why it's mixing up sports car and SUV, but whatever, as long as you're paying attention to it. Great. And then total will just be this total value here. So everything's just going to be that first frequency and then that percent, which is pretty straightforward. There's no like column and row percent because it's just out of the total sample. So if we want to do that, we can just say concat this. No, let's not do that. Do that. We'll just do this. You can drag it over one, right? 96, and then all we have to do is change this to G7, select it there, actually, 6, and then I can copy it. I mean, nah, let's not do that. I'll copy it over here and then do it for every single line that I see. Silver, white, great. Easy enough. And then I just do that same thing again where I find and select, go to special, likes, okay, and then I'd delete cells and shift cells out. Then I copy, put this right in here, and then I can do the same thing down right next to this one. Sorry, everybody. Just copy this. And I know it's right next to total, so I can just go right next to total here, right next to total here. But for yes, getting a little messy, but that's okay. We're almost done anyways. Cool. Okay, so everything is filled out on our table. Yay. Looks perfect. For an assignment, you would get a 100% on this. The only thing I might like recommend is I included percent here just to show the concatenate function. You really don't have to do that, right? Because we're already saying n%, so we already know the units. I include it. I don't think you're going to get points off if you include it, but you do not have to. I would keep in mind though that if you do say that it's n in percent, you're not going to want these to be decimal points because that implies that those decimal points are percentage points. So just helpful. So now let's talk about formatting a table. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to do it a way that I'm familiar with. You can literally just go on like PubMed, even just Google Scholar and search up demographic table or table one. And you'll see lots of good examples of how journals want them. So I'm going to do what I'm most familiar with, but you can just like find a reference to use and it's really helpful. So one thing that I already bolded everything, so I think that's all set up. I'm going to actually move this back, make that a little better. One thing that's super common in table journals is that they don't actually have these lines in between the different columns and rows. So we're going to get rid of them. So like I said before, you're going to now want to work in this table design tab at the top. And I'm going to highlight everything that's in my table. So all of my like values. And what I can do is I can just go to borders up here. Right now, all these borders are selected because everything is included. And I can just click no borders and that'll get rid of everything. Okay, let's do something different up here. So what you will see in journals is a line at the top of the table and a line underneath the table, underneath the variable names. Normally these are kind of bold, so we'll try to do that, recreate that here. So if we highlight each of these cells, we want to get rid of these kind of inside different lines, but we want to add a line below and keep that one up top. So if we go to borders, you can see these ones that are checked are the ones that are on the table right now. I want to get rid of the inside borders, so I'm going to click inside borders. It has a check, it's going to take it off. And I also want to get rid of the right border and the left border. So now all that's left is the top border. And now I'm going to add a bottom border. I just click that. See, so this is a pretty common way of setting up a table. Now, if you want to make these lines darker too, what you can do is highlight and you can say border styles and update it. So if I click a thicker border here, it's not going to do it yet until I actually select borders and tell it to make the bottom border like that and make the top border like that. But what you can also do, and I used to do this a lot before I got more familiar with tables, is it comes up with this like paintbrush, and you can literally just select and drag across to do it that way. I think that this is a little bit more tedious, but I guess it's kind of user-friendly and fun. And that's really all you have to do to format a table. It's pretty straightforward. The hardest part is really just setting up the shell and then, yeah, I guess putting in the values is really tedious, but hopefully if you do it kind of once set up in Excel, you can just use that same Excel file over and over again. Um, if you want to learn more about making a table one, feel free to reach out to me. There's lots of really, really great functions in R and Python. Specifically, there's a table one function or package, I think. So yeah, it's a ton of different functions that help you set up a table like this with like one line of code. It's super, super user friendly and easy. So if you wanted to talk about that, I'm happy to. Feel free to reach out and yeah, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so, so much.